Hello guys and welcome back to the channel. As promised, I've finally gotten around to finishing up the orc for today's video. There's a lot to get through here, so without further ado, let's get started on the metallics. For this, I decided to go for two slightly different variations of cold metal. I base coated most of the metal, like the axe and toe caps, with bolt gun metal. However, you could use lead belcher if you have that instead. The other darker areas here were base coated with iron warriors. I then proceed to shade everything with a mix of Nuln Oil and Agrax. Now if you're happy to continue to shade with that mix, then that's fine. However, I wanted to push the shading a bit stronger in some areas, so I decided to make a mix using black ink and wildwood contrast. This is a much stronger shade than the wash alone, and that really helped me to push the contrast between the two types of metal. This wildwood contrast is quite a strong brown, so you don't need to add too much of it. I also add a little bit of matte glaze medium into this shade, just to stop it going too shiny in the recesses. After the shading stage is done, I use Vallejo Model Air Silver to go around and highlight all the edges of the metal. Where the angles are sharp enough here, I'm using the side of the brush to carefully pick out the edge. I also pick out some chipping and scratching using the same highlight colour. For the trousers here, I base coated them with Storm Vermin Fur. This was followed by a soft shade of Skaven Blight Dinge with a touch of Corvus Black. I painted this into the recesses and glazed it towards the lower parts of the leg. Where necessary here, you can use Corvus Black on its own as a deep shade. I lined this into the seams and the deeper recesses of the cloth. So next, I glazed the trousers by adding Baneblade Brown into the Storm Vermin until I had a smooth transition towards the top of the legs. I follow this up by a highlight around the edges using pure Baneblade Brown. At the same time, I add a little bit of texture and scratching. For the next stage highlight here, I use Carrick Stone. I use it as an edge highlight and to brighten the texture and scratches. For the scaled pelt, I base coat it with a few coats of Snagga scale green. This is then shaded with a wash of thin black paint. I go around and tidy up the base coat and then follow this up with a subtle highlight, adding Sons of Horus green into the Snagga. Next, I highlighted the scales with pure Sons of Horus green. This is followed by a sharp edge highlight of 1:1 Sons of Horus green and Iron Rack skin. Finally, I added some dot highlights with Deepkin Flesh to finish off the scales. I added some neutral grey highlights around the edge of the pelt with Corvus Black, Eshin, Dawnstone and Administratum. I will use this same recipe later on for the boots. Next, it's time to paint the spikes that run along the back of the pelt. I have previously base coated these with Snagga scale green. Now I lay down some quick highlights along the top surface using Dawnstone grey. I blend this down into the shaded areas using a mix of Corvus Black and Snagga that I gradually add into the grey to create a smooth gradient. The strong contrast in shading here helps to make the spikes look sharp. Once that's done, I add some sharp highlights of Administratum grey, followed by Gracia. Finally here, I place some dot highlights with white on the corners of the spikes. For the boots here, I use a very straightforward black recipe. Base coat is black and then I follow this up with a chunky highlight of Corvus Black. The next slightly sharper highlight here is Eshin Grey. I tried to get this within the previous highlight stage. Finally, the sharp highlight is done with Dawnstone Grey and then Administratum. For the white armour here, I use pallid witch flesh, which is the same for the studio recipe Beast Snaggas. However, the base coat for this took a lot of patience, as the paint can be quite difficult to work with. I would recommend, if you struggle with this, to use another warm off-white instead. Once I have a solid base coat here, I create the first soft shade using a mix of pallid witch flesh and Baneblade brown. I find adding a little bit of glazed medium really helps with shading lighter colours like these. I continue to shade the other parts of white armour using Baneblade brown. Next, I'm going to mix a deep shade by adding Dryad Bark into the Baneblade brown. I am going to line this into the deeper recesses of the armour, including any battle damage and rivets. Next, I highlight with AK 3rd Gen White. This is my preferred white, but you can use any white of your choice. At the same time here, I am making small chips and scratches, which I will go on to pick out later on. Lastly, I also pick out the rivets with the white. For the battle damage here, I carefully paint Dryad Bark inside of the white chipping I added earlier, adding more around areas that would be likely to receive more damage, like the edges of the shoulder pad and the axe head. For the lower pelt here, I base coat it again with Stegadon green, and then I quickly block in a pattern with the mix of Iron Rack skin and Sons of Horus green. Between these layers, I smooth the transition by adding Stegadon into the mix. I carefully pick out some of the texture using Iron Rack skin. This is followed by glazes of Stegadon and Stegadon and black on the darker areas. This helps to smooth out the transitions and the highlights. I finish off the pelt with an edge highlight using Iron Rack and then Deepkin Flesh. Next, I make some red tooth or dags on the white armour by using corn red. After that's done, I add some chipping by using Pallid Witch Flesh. This helps to make the markings blend in with the rest of the damage on the armour. Next, it's time to paint the leather. For this, I start off with a base coat of Rhinox hide, to which I will add some Doomball brown. I blend up to a chunky highlight of pure Doomball brown. For the shading here, I make a mix of black and Rhinox hide. I slightly stipple this into the shading to create a bit of texture. For the next highlight, I use Mournfang brown. For this leather, I decided I wanted to create a bit of a cracked effect. So also with Mournfang, I create some scratches and texture around the worn edges of the leather. They're still quite subtle at this stage though. I follow this up with a highlight of XV88. Firstly, I pick out the edges, then I go in and start to render the texture a bit further. For the next highlight stage, I use a mix of XV88 and white, and with this I further pick out the extreme edges and brighten the scratches, working from the outside in. I continue to do this for the rest of the leather belts. I decided to add a little bit of subtle rust to the darker metallics. I do this by carefully glazing Mournfang brown into the recesses, and within that I will glaze Trollslayer orange. Next it's time to paint the red. For this I started off with a mix of Corn Red and Incubi Darkness. You could also use Baraknar Burgundy, however in this case I wish I'd started off a little bit brighter with Corn Red, and then instead glaze it down with the Burgundy. So next I glaze up the red with Corn Red. This is followed by a highlight of Wazdaka Red. This is followed by a sharper edge highlight of Squig Orange. And then Ungor Flesh, and finally Ungor and White. I continue to do this for the skull icon on the gun. Next up is the copper. For this I decide to use Proto-Acryl copper. On the right hand side of my palette here you can see some scale 75 pure copper. However, the Proto-Acryl tone was more to my taste for this. Both are great options though and super smooth. However, if you don't have these, the Citadel Hash-Up copper will do fine. I shade this copper first by adding Doomball Brown into it. I wanted a bit of a dull look here, so adding some paint into the metallic is fine and gives us more control over the shading than only using a wash. Next I shade using Wildwood Contrast. This is followed by a deep line shade of Doomball Brown and Black. Next, I highlight the copper by adding some Vallejo Model Air Silver. After blending up the copper, it was starting to look a little bit washed out, so I carefully glazed some Liquitex Transparent Burnt Sienna into the shading. I carefully then pick out the ammo belt, using the same neutral black recipe as the boots. For the yellow armor panel on the leg, I base coat it using Avaland. This is followed by adding Scrag Brown into it for the soft shade. I use Uriel Yellow as the first highlight, then I shade the rivets and damage using Doomball Brown. For the final highlight, I use Vallejo Ice Yellow, however you could also use Citadel Dawn Yellow. I add some dags using Mephiston Red and carefully add some fine chipping inside the highlights using Doomball Brown. I pick out the various stitching using Carrick Stone and then add white to it to highlight. Next, I finish the leather bracer by using the same recipe as the belt, adding scratches and texture here to make it feel like it's well worn. And then the last bits to do here are the straps on his left arm, which I base coat with Corvus Black. I follow this with a layer of Storm Vermin fur. And into the Storm Vermin I add Administratum Grey for the successive highlights. And then a final edge highlight of Gracia. I decided that I'm going to make a plinth base for this project. For the rocks here, I use a recipe of Milliput and Fimo to get a natural texture. These rocks are nice and lightweight and can be easily drilled and cut to shape. I hope to make a video on this process in the near future. I start by base coating the rocks with Corn Red. This is followed by a heavy dry brush of Wazdaka. Then I continue to dry brush with Squig Orange. So I continue to dry brush the rocks here with Towelite Ochre, which is followed by Ungor Flesh and then a little bit of Ushabti Bone. So I'm trying to get to a deserty or wasteland kind of look here, so eventually I add a few Vallejo pigments to the base to help me achieve that look. All that remains to do is to add some tufts and final details to the base, and the miniature is complete. Thank you to everyone for watching, and an extra thanks to those of you who have joined the Patreon. These videos take quite a while to produce and your support really helps. If you would like to buy this miniature, I will be putting a link to the eBay listing in the description below. See you in the next video.